Welcome to Canto per Canto. Today, we're going to talk about Inferno 33. I'm Ron Herzman here at SUNY Geneseo, and I'm with my good friend and colleague, Wes Kennison.
Hi, I'm faculty fellow for international programs here at SUNY Geneseo. And I guess most importantly, years ago, I was Ron's student back in the 70s. We took a Dante course. You may remember, Ron, you had a costume party at the end of the course when you invited everybody. And I came a little late, didn't get my costume done. So I just grabbed a head of lettuce and came up and shouted on the lettuce. I was Ugolino. So I like to think that that party prefigures 4 decades later our conversation here today. But we're happy to have this conversation here. Canto 33, and we're going to be discussing what I think is really the climactic moment of the story of the Inferno. To me, getting to Satan is a little bit like denouement. Once we meet the encounter of Ugolino and Ruggieri, and the tale that Ugolino tells of the tower.
So there are an awful lot of ways to start. I guess start with the most obvious and will remain the focal point. The canto starts with a pretty horrific image of Count Ugolino gnawing on the head of his arch enemy, the Archbishop Ruggieri, and then he tells us his story. Well, among other things, just pairing these two together, frozen, immobile in ice at the very bottom of the Inferno, is a way of bringing together what are the two, I think, major issues for Dante's own time that really continue throughout the Inferno. The one, of course, the inability of communities to get along, as exemplified most obviously in the Guelph-Ghibelline struggle, and two, the way that the temporal wealth and power of the church, the interference of the church in high-level power politics, has been corrupting both of the church itself and its spiritual mission, and of the political realm as well. So here you have, among other things, Guelph and Ghibelline brought together, and the secular and the religious brought together in this sort of strange and horrible cannibalistic punishment. A little bit of background. Pisa was a Ghibelline city that was surrounded by its Guelph neighbors. And somebody had the bright idea to bring in Ugolino, an outsider, and a Guelph to be the podestà, which is to say sort of a city manager. Why they thought of that? Possibly because maybe bringing in an outsider would mean he wouldn't be in anybody's pocket. Possibly because, hey man, we pay your salary, so tell your Guelph friends to back off. But in either case, it didn't work. He and Ruggieri, the Ghibelline archbishop, work out a sneaky alliance to rule the city. And then it turns out that it didn't work. Ugolino is betrayed by Ruggieri. And what happens, of course, in this spectacularly grim story that Ugolino tells us, he tells us about how he and his children were imprisoned and starved to death in a tower. And so from there, we start out with the story of Ugolino gnawing on the head of Ruggieri, and it just gets grimmer and grimmer from there.
Okay, so we want to share some text with you. This is what I said, Canto 33. We're going to pick it up at line 37 to line 51, and then skip down to line 67 to line 75. Okay. Apologies to the native speakers. Haven't been able to get back to Italy for a year or so here. So we'll start out with the text in Italian here. Quando fui desto innanzi la dimane, pianger senti far sonno I miei figlioli, che erano meco, e dimandar del pane. Pensa crudel, se tu già non ti duoli, pensando ciò il mio cor stronziava. E se non piangi, di che pianger suoli? già eran desti e l'ora s'appressava che il cibo ne solea essere adotto e per uno sogno ciascun dubitava. E io senti chiamar l'uscio di sotto all'orribile torre, l'ondio guardare nel viso e ai miei figlioli senza far motto. Io non piange, si dentro impetrai, piangevano egli. E Anselmuccio mio disse, tu guardi sì padre, che hai? Posce che fumo al quarto divenuti. Gaddo, mi si gitto disteso a piedi, dicendo, padre mio, che non mi aiuti. Qui vi morì, come tu mi vedi. Vidio cascar di 3 ad uno, tra il quinto e il sesto, ondio mi diedi. Ok. Già cieco a brancolare sopra ciascuno, e due li chiamai, poiché fur morti, poscia più che il dolore, poté il digiuno.
And then in English, when I awoke before the dawn, I heard my sons who were with me crying in their sleep and asking for bread. You are surely cruel if you did not already grieve, thinking what my heart was announcing to me. And if you were not weeping, about what do you usually weep? They were already awake, and the hour was drawing near when our food used to be brought to us, and each was afraid because of his dream. And I heard them nailing up the door at the base of the horrible tower. Hence, I looked into the faces of my son without a word. I was not weeping, so I turned to stone within. They were weeping, and my Anselmuccio said, you have such a look, father. What is it? After we had reached the 4th day, Gatto threw himself stretched out at my feet, saying, my father, why do you not help me? There he died, and as you see me, I saw the 3 fall, one by one, between the 5th day and the 6th. Then I, already blind, took to groping over each of them, and for 2 days I called them after they were dead. Then fasting had more power than grief.
Okay, I think that when we situate this canto in the larger movements of the poem, I certainly am very interested in the way that the sort of running conversation through Inferno that relates to politics, running parallel to the discussion that relates to poetry, come together here in one place. The 6 days in the tower here are the 6 days of the uncreation, especially if we sort of remember that the Genesis, creation begins with an act of speaking. And in the bottom of hell here, fraud has destroyed language and has led to the uncreation. And so I think it's important for us to sort of note that. It's very helpful to go back and to get the disclaimer that Dante offers us at the beginning of Canto 32 as we approach this place, where the poet laments that if he had rime aspra, if he had the verses crude enough to describe the bottom of hell, he would do it, but he falls short there, and then goes on to sort of underscore that this is no place for, I like Musa's rendering, no task for a tongue that gurgles baby talk, but not the place where we say mama and babbo. When Ugolino can't speak with his children, as they're locked up in the tower facing starvation, one of the reasons is they only have baby talk. And fraud has entirely betrayed their ability to speak to one another. Also, I think here the fraud is revealed in what Dante has done in the relationship between Ugolino and Ruggieri, in the sense that if Ugolino is the archbishop, his job is to feed the body and blood of Christ to Ugolino, and what he has actually done is to feed him the body and blood of his children.
Which, of course, leads us to that final line in the speech, the extraordinarily suggestive line that says that fasting in the English had more power than grief. A student coming to it for the first time sort of thinks about it and says, yes, they died of starvation, and Ugolino died a little bit later than they did. And then pause. Oh my God, is it suggesting that he ate his children? Well, one thing to say, of course, is that for a lot of different reasons, Dante doesn't quite come out and say that, in the same way that, let's say, the last words of Francesca da Rimini in Canto 5, where she basically says, that day we read no further, by not being more specific, it leads the reader to think of all of the possible energy that's contained in that line. If they had read further in the story of Lancelot, they would have learned that this is not a how-to book, but in fact a warning against adultery. They didn't read any further because they went from textual gratification to sexual gratification. They didn't read any further because they were cut short in their little enterprise and killed by a jealous husband. All of those things are contained in the line, at least in terms of possibility and in terms of sort of a principle of meditating on them. Well, what I want to suggest about the line, the comparable line at the end of Ugolino, is that if you think about this as he actually did eat his children, horror beyond belief, I think that's what Dante's trying to get at. But more specifically, it seems to me that it points toward the nature of the punishment of Ugolino. It's sort of interesting when you have two sinners who are locked together, immobile, frozen in ice. One of them gets to munch on the head of the other. If that were your choice, if you only could be one of the two, you surely would want to be the one who's doing the munching rather than the one who's being eaten. Except if you think about it as a kind of recreation of Ugolino's last moment, one of the things that happens is that, it tells us who he became, who he was, what ultimately defined him, and he is forced to reenact that eternally, so that from that perspective, one could argue that his punishment is even worse than that of Ruggieri. But in any case, what Dante is doing, of course, is using cannibalism as the image of this is as bad as it gets, this is as bad as it can get. What is sheer, unprotected, unvarnished evil? And what it seems to come down to, among other things, the image of cannibalism seems to be not able to be disconnected from the image of revenge as the ultimate thing that there is. And thinking about that, I think, if you'll pardon the bad pun, gives us a lot of food for thought for the present.
Yeah, I think, Ron, the sacramental parody here, the way it matches up with Genesis, is really important, because if we see the creation of the world as an act of speaking, and it's also then in that 6 days of creation that we learn that we are made in the image of the Creator. Well, if we only had that text to go by, the one thing that tells us is that we too can create worlds by speaking. And so the entire human enterprise is about finding words that are congruent, that match up to our observable experience and the created world in which we live. Fraud takes us the other direction, away from that. And so fraud then, as the betrayal of language, is the uncreation. If we go with Augustine and say that a sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, then the sort of truth and advertising dimension to that definition tells us that, in one sense, fraud is the opposite of a sacrament. Okay, and so the betrayal of Ugolino by Ruggieri in not feeding him the body and blood of Christ, but feeding him the innocent blood and flesh of his children is important. This is underscored if you pop into the cathedral in Pisa, the Pisano pulpit there. So the striking things about the biblical narrative that surrounds the pulpit is that the story of the life of Jesus goes straight from the slaughter of the innocents to the crucifixion. And so we have the connection of those two things. And of course, in medieval art, the image of the slaughter of the innocents was the image of a government, a community, a city, a nation gone mad.
And to pick it up from that, it's pretty clear that the suffering of innocence is one of the things that the Canto foregrounds in a pretty stark way. Ugolino wants us to have great pity for his children. He wants us to weep at it, even though he himself does not weep, even though his heart has turned to stone. But there are a couple of things that are, I think, important about that. Obviously, Dante wants to point out that these struggles between Guelphs and Ghibellines and secular and sacred are not abstract things. They result in an extraordinary amount of suffering on the part of people who had nothing at all to do with what's going on at the top of the food chain. And so what better way to talk about that than to talk about the suffering of innocence? And it's kind of interesting in that regard that at the very beginning of his discourse, when Ugolino decides that he's going to tell his story, basically what he says is, I don't really care how much this hurts me to talk about what happened back there. And parenthetically, I would argue it hurts a whole lot more with the recognition that, in fact, it ended by his eating his children. But he says, as long as this brings revenge to the guy who brought me here, I don't care. Well, I think that that's as good a definition of hell as you're ever likely going to get. That it does not matter how bad I hurt myself, as long as I can extract my revenge. And I think it's also a good way of illustrating something that is pretty much born throughout the entire Inferno, that however much evil is caused to others, and Dante surely points that out in any number of different ways, the primary victim of a sin is always the perpetrator of it. And Ugolino, despite the suffering of the innocents, is really the poster child for that, bringing it all together at the end.
Yeah, I think that if we see these two strains of politics and poetry colliding here in this point of the converging weight of hell, if we understand what the role of the poet is the guardian of language. The poet is the person who wants to bring language back into a sense of truthful association with our experience, as opposed to leading it away. I think this is really relevant in talking to our students these days, since we seem to have developed the technology to mass produce fraud on an amazing scale here. And I think it's very important for our students to get some sense of what Dante thought fraud was, how to recognize it, how fraud works, and what the consequences of it are. Because when we unravel language, we unravel all the things that language does to hold us together as a community. And where we're left is in this moment of brutality here.
And also, just to make one final point about the way in which Dante wants to see this as something definite and final, evil kind of brought to its farthest extreme, is that the image of cannibalism, which is so vividly presented to us in Ugolino, in a much less vivid way, a kind of more mechanical way. It's part of the mechanical apparatus, if you will, of Satan himself, who is there essentially cannibalizing the three greatest sinners, and of course with Judas in the middle head first. So it's again another way of kind of linking it to taking it as far as it possibly can go. And I guess that might be as good a place as any. On that happy note, Wes, do you have a real happy note for us to end on?
Yeah, I can't get happier than this, Ron.
Okay. So thanks so much for this opportunity.
Appreciate it.